Have you ever been judged by the uniform you wear? Landon Carter III, a man who built his empire on the wreckage of other men's dreams, certainly did. He looked at Clara May Thompson, a quiet waitress at the city's most exclusive restaurant, and saw nothing more than a pair of hands. He mistook her silence for simplicity. He assumed her apron was the sum of her ambition. He decided, for the amusement of his court, to make an example of her, to crush her spirit for a moment's sport. But Landon, a master of hostile takeovers, made a fatal miscalculation. He didn't know that the young woman refilling his water glass possessed a secret, a knowledge so deep and precise it could dismantle his world piece by piece. He wanted to prove she was simple. Instead, he handed her the very tools she needed to expose him as a fraud. This is the story of what happens when new money arrogance collides with old-world genius. The pinnacle was a temple of glass and steel, a revolving shrine to corporate conquest perched atop Chicago's tallest skyscraper. The city sprawled below, a glittering circuit board of light and motion, but up here, the air was different. It was thin, sterile, and smelled of seared scallops, vintage Bordeaux, and the kind of power that measured itself in quarterly earnings reports. The staff were trained to be ghosts, gliding across plush, sound-dampening carpets with practiced invisibility. Clara May Thompson adjusted the starched collar of her black uniform, the fabric chafing her neck. A dull ache radiated from the arches of her feet, a familiar companion after 10 hours of perpetual motion. It was her second double shift this week, each one a small sacrifice laid on the altar of her grandfather's mounting medical bills. At 22, Clara had the unassuming features of someone who had learned early to take up as little space as possible. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her most prominent feature was a look of intense, quiet observation in her hazel eyes, a look most patrons were too self-absorbed to ever notice. To them, she was simply the mechanism that delivered their wagyu and cleared away the debris of their indulgence. "Clara May!" The voice was a venomous whisper from the service station. Gregory, the floor manager, a man whose spine seemed to have been surgically replaced with a gelatinous rod of anxiety, was flapping a hand at her. "Table 7. It's Landon Carter. For God's sake, don't breathe wrong. He's already complained that the ice in his water is melting at a sub-optimal rate." Clara took a slow, centering breath. Landon Carter III. The name echoed through the city's financial district like a threat. He was the 35-year-old titan of Carter Capital, a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring legacy companies, stripping them of their assets, and selling the hollowed-out husks for scrap. He was rapaciously brilliant, handsome in a way that suggested a well-fed predator, and notoriously cruel. His public persona was that of a visionary disruptor. The whispers in the back rooms called him a corporate ghoul. She picked up the silver tray holding a bottle of sparkling water, its condensation tracing cold lines against her skin, and approached the table. Carter sat at the prime seat, the one that offered an unobstructed view of the city's glittering expanse. He was flanked by 2 younger men in identical charcoal suits, their faces a mixture of admiration and terror. Carter himself was leaning back, his posture expansive, occupying the space of 2 men. He was in the middle of a story, his voice a confident baritone that sliced through the restaurant's polite murmur. "So I told the union rep, your pension fund is a historical artifact. My shareholders are the future." We initiated the liquidation protocol an hour later. 2,000 jobs gone before lunch. You should have seen their faces. One of the sycophants, a man named Jeremy, let out a dry, appreciative chuckle. "That's why you're the king, LC. No sentiment." Clara arrived at the table, her presence a silent intrusion. "Good evening, gentlemen. The San Pellegrino you requested." She moved to pour the water with the fluid economy of motion, born of 1,000 repetitions. She kept her gaze lowered, focused on the task, a ritual of subservience. But Carter stopped talking. He didn't look at the water. His eyes, the color of polished steel, fixed on her hand, then traveled up her arm to her face. "Hold it," Carter said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a cutting edge that made the entire table fall silent. He held up a hand, fingers splayed, inches from her face. Clara froze, the bottle hovering over his glass. "Is there a problem, sir?" "You're hesitating," Carter stated, as if delivering a verdict. He turned to his associates. "Look at her. The tremor in her hand. She's nervous. Inefficiency. It's the cancer of the service industry." He looked back at Clara, a smirk playing on his perfectly sculpted lips. "This is a simple task, sweetheart. Water into a glass. We're not asking you to solve cold fusion. Or did they not cover gravitational physics in Waitress school?" Clara felt a hot flush creep up her neck. Her hand was perfectly steady. He was inventing a flaw, creating a drama for his own entertainment. He was bored. "My apologies, sir," she said, her voice a soft, even murmur. She tilted the bottle, the water flowing in a silent, perfect stream. "I will endeavor to be more efficient." "You do that," Carter sneered, dabbing his lips with a linen napkin. "It's the great tragedy of our time, isn't it?" he mused to his companions. "Here we are, discussing the restructuring of global supply chains, and our cognitive momentum is interrupted by the basic incompetence of the help." The other young man, Brad, shifted uncomfortably. "Landon, come on. She's just pouring water." "Poorly," Carter countered without looking at him. He took a sip, then set the glass down. His gaze fell on her again. She was still standing there, tray in hand, waiting to be dismissed. Her lack of a flustered, tearful reaction seemed to irritate him. He wanted a response, a crack in her composure. Her quiet dignity was an affront. He decided to escalate. "Tell me," he said, leaning forward, his elbows on the table, a glint of malicious curiosity in his eyes. "What's the most complicated decision you've had to make today? Was it remembering which table gets the bread basket first? Or perhaps the existential quandary of decaf versus regular?" Jeremy snickered. Clara's grip tightened on the cool metal of the tray. She needed this job. The image of her grandfather, frail and wheezing in his small apartment, flashed in her mind. His medication, the oxygen concentrator, the visiting nurse. It all depended on nights like this, on enduring men like this. She couldn't afford the luxury of anger. "My primary focus is ensuring our guests have a pleasant and seamless dining experience, Mr. Carter," she replied, her voice as smooth and untroubled as a deep lake. "Seamless," Carter repeated, drawing the word out with mocking slowness. What a tragically limited vocabulary. You see, this is the core issue. A cognitive ceiling. Some people are born to innovate, to command, to build empires. And others, he gestured vaguely at her uniform, are born to carry trays. It's not an economic disparity. It's a biological one. He waved a dismissive hand. "You can go. And try to walk and breathe at the same time. We wouldn't want you to overexert yourself." Clara turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured. As she passed into the shadows of the service corridor, she finally allowed her composure to falter. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the tray. She wasn't just a waitress. Landon Carter didn't know that for the past decade. Since she was a little girl, Clara May Thompson had been the apprentice to a master. She hadn't gone to college. Her education had taken place at a dusty workbench in her grandfather's small shop, surrounded by the smell of lubricating oil and old brass. Her playground had been a world of escapements, balance wheels and tourbillons. She didn't have a degree, but she could diagnose the ailment of a Patek Philippe grand complication from across a room just by the rhythm of its ticking. Landon Carter didn't know that the grandfather she was working to support, Silas Thompson, was once considered one of the world's finest horologists, a man who had dedicated his life to the art of mechanical timekeeping. He didn't know that Silas's health had been broken by silicosis, his lungs scarred by decades of breathing in the fine dust from polishing watch components. And he certainly didn't know that the man he was currently in the process of destroying, Elias Vance, the venerable head of the Swiss watchmaker Ormont and Fils, was her grandfather's oldest and dearest friend. Landon Carter wasn't just a rude, arrogant bully. He was the architect of her family's private misery. And tonight, with a breathtaking ignorance, he was practically begging her to show him the error of his ways. An hour later, as the main courses were being cleared, the mood at Table 7 had turned from smug celebration to tense negotiation. Carter was on a conference call, his phone on speaker, its tinny voice filling the space. "The board is wavering, Landon," the voice said. "Vance is making an emotional appeal to the shareholders, talking about legacy, craftsmanship." Carter cut him off with a guttural laugh. "Legacy doesn't pay dividends. Craftsmanship is a euphemism for inefficiency. I've got them in a vice. They have an archaic debt covenant from the 1930s they've forgotten about. My legal team found it. We bought the debt for pennies. We call it in. They can't pay, and the company is ours. It's checkmate. Tell the board to accept my offer of $40 a share, or I'll bankrupt them by Friday and pick up the pieces for free." Clara moved silently, clearing the plates, her ears tuned to every word. Ormont and Fils. Her grandfather's letters from Elias Vance were filled with despair over Carter's predatory tactics. He was trying to steal 150 years of history. As she reached for Carter's plate, he ended the call and looked up. His eyes fell on his own wrist. He was wearing a watch of breathtaking complexity, an Ormont and Fils Grande Sonnerie, a minute repeater with a perpetual calendar and a flying tourbillon. It was a masterpiece, one of only 3 ever made. It was also a trophy, acquired from the bankrupt estate of his last victim. Suddenly, he grabbed her wrist. The touch was not violent, but it was firm and shocking, a flagrant breach of decorum. The low hum of the restaurant seemed to dip for a moment. "Let's play a little game," Carter said, his eyes gleaming with a familiar, cruel energy. He was high on his own power, emboldened by the wine and his recent victory. He looked at Jeremy and Brad, then back at Clara, a predator toying with its prey. "My associates think I overlook the small details. I maintain that true genius lies in seeing the big picture and ignoring the noise." He gestured to the watch on his wrist. "You've been staring at my watch all night. Don't deny it." Clara hadn't been, but she didn't argue. "It's a very striking timepiece, sir." "Striking," he chuckled. "An adequate word for a simpleton." He unclasped the watch, its platinum case gleaming under the soft lights, and slapped it onto the white tablecloth. The sound was obscene. "Here's the deal. I'll give you a tip, a big one." He pulled out a thick money clip and peeled off 10 crisp $100 bills, tossing them next to the watch. $1,000, more than you make in a week, I'd wager. It's yours, if you can tell me one single meaningful thing about this watch. Something more than "it's shiny" or "it's expensive." His smile widened. "But if you get it wrong, if you say something stupid, I'll have you fired, right here, right now, for incompetence." Brad paled. "Landon, that's not fair. How would she know anything about—" Shut up, Brad. It's a test. A field experiment in cognitive stratification. He leaned back, crossing his arms. Well, sweetheart, feeling lucky? Want to play? Clara looked at the money. It would cover a full month of her grandfather's nursing care. Then she looked at the watch. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry to her. It was a living thing, a mechanical heart beating 4 times per second. It was the culmination of a legacy he was trying to turn into scrap metal. She looked up and met Landon Carter's smug, contemptuous gaze. "What are the rules of the game?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. "The rule is you have 60 seconds to impress me," he laughed. "Go on, dazzle me with your deep horological insights." The other diners were starting to watch now, sensing the drama. Gregory, the manager, hovered in the corner, wringing his hands, his face a mask of terror. He was too afraid of Carter's influence to intervene. Clara didn't reach for the watch. She didn't even look at its intricate face. Instead, she did something strange. She closed her eyes. "What is she doing?" Carter mocked. "Praying for an answer?" Clara slowly raised a hand. "Could I ask for a moment of silence, please?" The request was so absurd, so out of place, that a hush fell over the nearby tables. Carter, intrigued despite himself, gestured for his men to be quiet. In the relative silence, punctuated only by the distant clink of cutlery, Clara leaned forward, her ear hovering just inches above the watch lying on the table. For 10 seconds, she was perfectly still. To the others it was bizarre theatre. To Clara, it was a symphony. She listened past the ambient noise, focusing on the tiny rhythmic pulse of the mechanism within. She heard the delicate whir of the tourbillon cage, the gentle click of the date wheel, the whisper of the gears. But underneath it all, she heard something else. A flaw, a tiny, almost imperceptible arrhythmia in the escapement's song, a faint, galloping beat where there should have been a perfect, steady isochronism. She opened her eyes. "Well?" Carter prompted, his patience wearing thin. "Is it powered by magic hamsters? Did you get a divine revelation?" Clara reached out and, gently, with a reverence that was a rebuke in itself, picked up the $1,000. She folded the bills neatly and tucked them into her apron pocket. Then, she looked Carter directly in the eye. "It's a magnificent piece of engineering, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice gaining a new, authoritative timbre. "The Ormont Caliber 7B, a 48-joule movement with a 1-minute flying tourbillon and a cathedral gong minute repeater." Carter's smirk faltered slightly. She knew the caliber number. "But it's broken," she continued softly. A wave of shock rippled through the onlookers. Carter's face darkened. "What did you say? This watch is worth more than your entire life. It's perfect." "No, sir, it's not," Clara said, her confidence unshakable. She didn't need to see the mechanism. She had heard its confession. "The pallet jewel on the escape lever, the exit jewel to be precise, is misaligned. By my ear, I'd estimate it's off by 3, maybe 4 microns. It's causing the balance spring to overbank ever so slightly on every 4th oscillation. It's a condition we call a galloping escapement." She leaned forward, her voice dropping but carrying a deadly precision. "Right now, it's probably losing about 12 seconds a day. You might not notice, but the abnormal friction is putting a cumulative strain on the mainspring barrel. In 6 months, maybe 8, the barrel will seize. The resulting shockwave will shatter the balance staff and mangle the entire gear train. It won't just stop working. It will tear itself apart from the inside out." She straightened up, her gaze never leaving his. "So, the most meaningful thing I can tell you about your watch, sir, is that it's dying. And you were so busy admiring its face that you never once stopped to listen to its heart. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence fell over the table, over the entire section of the restaurant. Jeremy and Brad stared, their mouths agape. Carter's face had gone from smug to shocked to a deep, blotchy red of pure fury. He snatched the watch from the table, his hand trembling with rage. That's impossible. You're lying. You're trying to humiliate me." "Am I?" Clara asked calmly. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. From it, she produced a watchmaker's loop, the small magnifying glass. She held it out to him. "There's an independent horologist on Oak Street, a Mr. Dubois. Take it to him tomorrow. Ask him to put it on a time grapher and examine the escapement under magnification. He'll tell you the same thing." She put the loop back in her pocket. "You won the bet, sir." "Thank you for the tip." She turned to Gregory, who looked as if he was about to faint. "I believe my shift is over." Without waiting for a reply, Clara turned and walked away. She didn't run. Her steps were deliberate, each one landing with a newfound weight. She could feel Landon Carter's eyes boring into her back, a tangible heat of incandescent rage. She hadn't just answered his question. She had dismantled his prize, exposed a flaw in his perfection in front of his disciples. A man like Landon Carter didn't learn lessons. He didn't tolerate humiliation. He exacted revenge. And Clara May Thompson, the quiet waitress, had just declared war. The penthouse office of Carter Capital was a monument to minimalist aggression, polished concrete floors, a desk carved from a single piece of obsidian, and a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a god's-eye view of the city he considered his kingdom. It was 2 a.m, but the room was ablaze with light. Landon Carter was not sleeping. He was pacing, a caged panther in a bespoke suit. On his desk, nestled on a black velvet cloth, was the Aumont and Fils watch. Beside it lay a single sheet of paper, a report from Jean-Pierre Dubois, the finest horologist in Chicago. Carter had roused the old man from his bed at midnight, demanding an immediate appraisal, dangling a sum of money so large it was an insult. The verdict was scrawled at the bottom of the page in elegant cursive. Catastrophic misalignment of exit pallet jewel, progressive mainspring fatigue, prognosis, terminal without complete overhaul. She was right. The waitress, she was right down to the micron. "Impossible," Carter muttered, pouring a generous measure of Macallan 25 into a crystal tumbler. His hand, usually so steady when signing billion-dollar deals, had a slight tremor. It wasn't the potential loss of the watch that unnerved him. It was the violation. It was the sheer, inexplicable impossibility of it. How could she know? It was like a janitor glancing at a rocket engine and correctly diagnosing a fault in the fuel injector's gimbal mount. The intercom on his desk buzzed, a harsh, unwelcome sound. "Mr. Carter, I have the preliminary background check you requested." "Send him in," Carter barked. Jeremy, his associate from dinner, scurried in, looking pale and sleep-deprived. He held a slim digital tablet, which he placed on the desk as if it were radioactive. "You're not going to believe this, Elsie." Carter snatched the tablet. "Who is she? A plant? Corporate espionage from the Swiss? Did Vance hire a private investigator to pose as a waitress?" "No, sir. Nothing like that," Jeremy said, his voice barely a whisper. "Her name is Clara May Thompson, age 22. No college education, no criminal record, no social media presence. For the past 2 years, she's worked at the Pinnacle. Before that, a diner in Evanston. She lives in a rundown apartment in Pilsen with her grandfather." "The grandfather," Carter said, his eyes narrowing. "Who is he?" Jeremy swallowed. That's That's the part you're not going to believe. His name is Silas Thompson." He tapped the screen, and an old black and white photograph appeared. A younger man with kind eyes and clever hands was standing next to a distinguished-looking gentleman. Both were smiling, holding a complex-looking watch movement between them. Silas Thompson was a horologist, according to the archives, one of the best of his generation, a prodigy. And the man he's standing with, that's a young Elias Vance, the CEO of Ormont and Phil's. They were friends, colleagues. The Scotch glass stopped halfway to Carter's lips. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. It wasn't a lucky guess. It wasn't a spy. It was legacy. It was the very thing he despised. A slow, reptilian smile spread across his face. The confusion and fear evaporated, replaced by the cold, familiar comfort of malice. "So," he murmured, setting the glass down. "She's not just some random savant. She's a legacy, the last gasp of a dying world, and she was hiding right under my nose." "She humiliated you, Landon," Jeremy warned, taking a half step back. "In public. If this story gets out, that a waitress diagnosed your prize watch better than you could, the blogs will have a field day. It makes you look foolish." "No," Carter said, his voice dangerously soft. "You're thinking too small. We don't bury the story. We rewrite it." He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over his contacts. "Get me Gregory, the manager at the Pinnacle. Tell him if he values his job, his pension, and the restaurant's liquor license, he'll meet me in my office in 30 minutes. And tell him to bring the security footage from tonight." "What are you going to do?" Jeremy asked, his eyes wide. "I'm going to teach Miss Clara May Thompson a lesson about the modern world," Carter sneered, his reflection a distorted mask in the dark window. "Her grandfather's world of gears and springs is dead. In my world, truth is not a constant. It's a commodity. And I'm about to buy all of it." The following evening, Clara arrived at the Pinnacle, 15 minutes early, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The $1,000 from the night before was a small miracle, already allocated to a better oxygen machine for her grandfather. It was a tangible victory, but she knew it had come at a price she had yet to pay. She pushed through the service entrance, the familiar scent of disinfectant and cooking oil filling the air. The pre-shift buzz was usually a chaotic symphony of clattering pans, shouting chefs, and the hiss of the grills. Tonight, the kitchen was eerily quiet. As Clara walked in, the prep cooks paused, their knives hovering over cutting boards. The dishwashers averted their gaze. The silence was thick, accusatory. "Thompson." The voice was Gregory's, but it lacked its usual wheedling tone. It was flat, cold. He stood by the swinging doors to the dining room. Flanking him were two burly men in black suits she'd never seen before, and leaning against a stainless steel counter behind them, a picture of casual menace, was Landon Carter. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She kept her face a careful blank. "Is there a problem, Mr. Henderson?" "I'm afraid there is," Gregory said, his voice trembling slightly. He refused to meet her eyes, focusing on a spot on the wall behind her head. "We've received a complaint, a very serious one." "From whom?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. "From me," Carter said, stepping forward. His handmade leather shoes made no sound on the tile floor. "You see, Clara, after our little performance last night, I went home and noticed something was missing." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "My watch, the Ormont and Phil's you so admired." Clara's eyes widened. "That's absurd. I gave it back to you at the table." "Did you?" Carter raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow. "That's not what the security footage shows." He nodded to Gregory, who nervously tapped a tablet. He turned the screen to face her. It showed a grainy, black and white video of the dining room. It showed Carter placing the watch on the table. It showed Clara leaning over, her body momentarily obscuring the camera's view. And when she straightened up, the watch was gone. The video was a lie. It had been edited, cleverly manipulated to create a moment that never happened. "What is this?" Clara whispered. "It's evidence," Carter said smoothly. "It shows you palming my watch while pretending to listen to it. A clever bit of sleight of hand. I have to admit, I'm impressed." "You doctored that footage," Clara said, her voice rising in disbelief. She looked at Gregory. "Mr. Henderson, you were there. You know this is a lie. Tell him." "The police have been notified," Carter interrupted, his voice a silken threat. "Grand larceny. Given the value of the watch, that's a felony. We're talking 5 to 10 years in prison, Clara. A tragic end to the Thompson family legacy, wouldn't you say? Your grandfather dies of a broken heart, and you rot in a cell." The blood drained from her face. This wasn't just about getting her fired. This was about annihilation. He wanted to erase her, to salt the earth of her entire existence. "However," Carter continued, checking a different, far less valuable watch on his other wrist, "I'm a forgiving man. I believe in second chances." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. The scent of his expensive cologne was suffocating. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper only she could hear. "Here's my final offer. You will sign a full confession, admitting you stole the watch and that your little story about it being broken was a lie you invented to cover your tracks. In return, I will be merciful and decline to press charges. You'll be fired, of course, and I will personally see to it that you are blacklisted from every restaurant, hotel, and retail establishment in this city. You won't be able to get a job sweeping floors. You and your grandfather will be destitute within a month. Or you can fight me, and I will spend millions of dollars to ensure you are convicted and sent to prison." He pulled back, his public smile returning. "The choice is yours, a quiet, miserable life of poverty, or a loud, miserable life in a cage." Clara looked at Gregory. The manager stared at his shoes, shame radiating from him in palpable waves. He was a coward, a man who would sell his soul for a quiet life. She looked at her fellow kitchen staff. They stood frozen, their faces a mixture of fear and pity. They were powerless, caught in the gravitational pull of Carter's wealth. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear. It was a different sensation. A cold, clarifying rage was rising within her, a feeling she hadn't known since she was a child watching her grandfather's business slowly fail against a tide of cheap, disposable quartz watches. He thought he was offering her a choice between two prisons. He didn't realize he was offering her a weapon. Slowly, deliberately, she began to untie her apron. She let it fall to the floor in a heap. "You think this is a checkmate," she said, her voice quiet, but resonating with a strange new power. "You think because you can buy lawyers and edit videos, you can rewrite the laws of physics." "I don't rewrite them, darling," Carter laughed. "I just own the universe they operate in." Clara adjusted the cheap glasses on her nose. "A watch movement, Mr. Carter, is a closed system governed by immutable laws. So is the truth. You can dress it up, you can try to obscure it, but eventually the mechanism finds its equilibrium." She looked him dead in the eye. "You didn't just create a lie, you created a flaw in your own system, and I am going to exploit it until your entire world unwinds. She turned and walked out the back door into the grimy alleyway, slick with rain. She didn't look back. As the heavy steel door slammed shut, plunging the alley into near darkness, Clara May Thompson made a decision. She was done being a ghost. It was time to become a gear in a machine of her own making. For 3 days, Clara existed in a state of suspended animation, fueled by cheap coffee and cold fury. Her tiny apartment, usually a haven of quiet order, was now a war room. The peeling paint and hissing radiator faded into the background. On the small kitchen table, amidst scattered horological textbooks and her grandfather's old schematics, sat a battered laptop. She had spent 2 of the 3 days not sleeping, but researching, cross-referencing, and diving down rabbit holes of corporate law and financial history. Landon Carter thought he had exiled her to a desert of poverty. He assumed her world was small, limited to bus schedules and tip jars. He had forgotten who she was, the granddaughter of Silas Thompson, a man who believed that any system, no matter how complex, could be understood if you simply had the patience to observe its workings. Clara was applying that principle not to a watch, but to Carter Capital. She was staring at a stock market feed. As Carter had announced at dinner, his hostile takeover bid for Ormont and Fils was official. The financial news channels were running with it, portraying Carter as a bold modernizer, and Ormont as a relic of a bygone era. Clara knew the truth. He wasn't buying it to save it. He was buying it to execute it. He would gut the workshops in Lebrassus, sell the brand name to a Chinese conglomerate to stamp on cheap fashion watches, and auction off 150 years of irreplaceable tools and archives. It was his signature move, turning history into cash. Her grandfather, sitting in his armchair in the corner, had been watching the news with her. His breathing was labored, but his eyes were sharp with a lifetime of accumulated wisdom. "He thinks the value is in the name, Clara May." Silas wheezed, his voice thin as paper. "He doesn't understand. The value, the legacy, it's in the metal. It's in the knowledge passed down from hand to hand." An idea, sharp and brilliant as a diamond cutter, sliced through Clara's exhaustion. "It's in the metal." She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had found after hours of painstaking research, the direct line for the Ormont and Fils headquarters in Switzerland. She knew she wouldn't get through to Elias Vance, but she was counting on it. After being transferred through 4 layers of polite, dismissive assistants, she finally reached the voicemail of a senior vice president. She didn't leave her name. She left a puzzle. "This is a message for Mr. Elias Vance," she said, her voice crisp and clear. "Please tell him that Landon Carter's leverage is a ghost. The debt covenant from 1933 he is using to force the sale is invalid. Ask Mr. Vance to look at the corporate archives for that year, specifically the material composition records for the balance springs. The answer is in the alloy." She paused. "Tell him Silas Thompson's granddaughter sends her regards." She hung up. It was a long shot, a message in a bottle tossed into a corporate ocean. For 2 days there was nothing. Clara started to lose hope. She was down to her last $80. The eviction notice was a certainty. On the 3rd day, as she was measuring out her grandfather's medication, her phone rang. The number was international. "Is this Miss Thompson?" The voice was old, tinged with a faint Swiss-French accent and weary with the weight of a long battle. "This is she," Clara said, her heart leaping. "This is Elias Vance. I must confess, your message was unorthodox. My people advised me to ignore it. But you mentioned your grandfather, and you mentioned the alloy." There was a pause. "My archivist has spent the last 48 hours searching. We found the records, An alloy of iron, nickel, and beryllium. An early experiment in creating thermally stable springs. What does this have to do with the debt? Mr. Carter claims his holding company bought a corporate bond, Ormont, issued in 1933, to a small investment firm that later went bankrupt, Clara explained, her words coming faster now. He's using that bond to claim a majority creditor position. But that bond document, the original paper he's using as proof, is a forgery. We suspected as much, but we cannot prove it, Vance said tiredly. His experts have authenticated the paper, the ink, the typewriter font. They say it is genuine to the period. The paper might be genuine, Clara said, a tremor of excitement in her voice. But the story isn't. In 1933, the year that bond was supposedly issued, Ormont and Fils was on the verge of bankruptcy because of that experimental alloy. The balance springs were a failure. They were brittle. They shattered. The company had to recall every watch from that year. It nearly destroyed them. They didn't issue bonds that year, Mr. Vance. They were selling off furniture to make payroll. She had read about the brittle spring crisis in her grandfather's journals. It was a cautionary tale, he told her often. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Clara could hear the faint sound of papers rustling. My God, Vance whispered. The fallow year. My own father called it that. We have no record of issuing any debt. Carter's team is brilliant, Clara continued, pacing her small room. They found a historical blind spot. They created a document that looked perfect. But they didn't know the context. They didn't know the story behind the history. They made a perfect forgery of an event that never happened. Child, how do you know all this? Vance asked, his voice filled with a new sense of awe. My grandfather told me, Clara said simply. He believes a company's soul is in its stories, not its stock price. She took a deep breath. Mr. Vance, I can prove the forgery, but I need your help. I need access to your archives, and I need a seat at the table when you next meet with Carter. There was another pause, longer this time. Clara held her breath. She was asking a titan of industry to trust an unemployed waitress from Chicago based on family stories. Your grandfather was the most gifted man I ever knew, Vance said finally, his voice thick with emotion. He could see the truth in a mechanism better than any man alive. It seems he passed that gift on to you. He cleared his throat. I am meeting Carter and his lawyers in Chicago in 2 days to finalize the sale. The board has already voted to accept his terms. I am expected to surrender. Don't, Clara commanded, her voice ringing with newfound authority. Tell them you need to introduce your new consultant, an expert in historical asset verification. They will laugh me out of the room, Vance lamented. Let them laugh, Clara said, a cold smile touching her lips for the first time in days. The man who laughs last, Mr. Vance, is the one who has taken the time to check his work. The boardroom on the 50th floor of a downtown law firm was designed to intimidate. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the grim Chicago skyline. On one side sat Landon Carter, flanked by a team of predatory lawyers. He looked relaxed, triumphant, a king surveying his newly conquered territory. On the other side sat Elias Vance, looking frail and defeated, his shoulders slumped. With him were 2 of his own lawyers, their faces grim. Let's get this over with, Elias, Carter said, not bothering to hide his glee. Sign the papers. You can retire to the Alps and I can begin the necessary work of bringing your charming little antique shop into the 21st century. Vance took a shaky breath. Before we proceed, Landon, there is one more member of my team I would like you to meet. Carter rolled his eyes. Don't tell me you've brought in another banker with another failed counteroffer. "No," Vance said, his gaze fixed on the boardroom door. "I have brought an expert." The door opened. Clara May Thompson walked in. She wasn't wearing her waitress uniform. She was wearing a simple, dark grey dress she'd bought from a thrift store, impeccably clean and pressed. Her hair was pulled back, and her face was devoid of makeup. She looked utterly out of place, a sparrow in a cage of eagles. She carried a single worn leather briefcase. Landon Carter froze. His smug expression dissolved into a mask of disbelief, which quickly morphed into incandescent rage. "What is the meaning of this? Get her out of here. She's a thief. I have a restraining order being filed against this woman." "She is here as a consultant for Ormont and Fils," Vance said, a spark of his old fire returning to his eyes. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Please, Miss Thompson." Clara sat down, placing the briefcase on the table with a soft click. She looked directly at Carter, her expression unreadable. "Hello, Mr. Carter. We have some unfinished business to discuss." One of Carter's lawyers, a severe-looking man named Silas Grant, stood up. "This is a farce. This woman has no standing here. She is a disgruntled former service employee with a criminal complaint pending against her." "A complaint, Mr. Grant, but no charges," Clara said calmly, opening her briefcase. "Because Mr. Carter never actually filed a police report, did he? It's hard to report a watch stolen when it's still in your possession. A fact which a simple subpoena of his household effects would easily reveal." Carter's eyes narrowed to slits. She had called his bluff. Clara pulled out a single, yellowed document and placed it on the table. It was the 1933 corporate bond. "This is the foundation of your claim, Mr. Carter. A beautifully crafted piece of fiction." Grant scoffed. "That document has been authenticated by 3 independent experts. The paper is Ragsdale linen from the period. The ink is iron gall. The typography is consistent with a 1932 Underwood typewriter. It's unimpeachable." "I agree," Clara said, shocking everyone. "It's a perfect forgery. Your team did incredible work, but they made one small, critical error." She pulled out a second document, a high-resolution photograph this time. It showed a microscopic view of a section of the bond. "You see this watermark? A small eagle with a shield. The official watermark of the United States Treasury Printing Office at the time," Grant said smugly. "It only proves its authenticity." "Almost," Clara said. She slid another photograph across the table. It showed another watermark, nearly identical. "This is the same watermark. And this one," she slid a third photo, "is another. Your experts authenticated the paper, but they didn't authenticate the watermark itself, because if they had, they would have discovered a fascinating little piece of history." She stood up, her voice filling the silent room. "During the Great Depression, the Treasury Printing Office had several different dyes for their watermarks, each with minute variations. The specific dye used for this eagle, with the tiny scratch above the left wing and the slight flattening of the shield's third stripe, was only put into service in November of 1934. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "The bond is dated February 1933. Mr. Carter, your team has created a document on paper that would not exist for another 21 months. It is a temporal impossibility. It is not just a forgery. It is a clumsy, arrogant forgery." The color drained from Silas Grant's face. He snatched the photos, pulling a pair of glasses from his pocket to examine them, his hands shaking. Carter stared at Clara, his mouth slightly agape. He was a man who dealt in billions, in market forces, in brute strength. He had been undone by a scratch on a watermark, a detail so small, so insignificant, that no one in his world would ever have thought to look for it. This is preposterous," Carter stammered, but the bravado was gone from his voice. "Is it?" Clara asked. She reached back into her briefcase and pulled out one last item. It was a thick, leather-bound ledger. "This is the personal journal of my grandfather, Silas Thompson, from his first apprenticeship at Ormont in the 1930s. He was a meticulous record keeper. In it, he details the brittle spring crisis of 1933. He writes about the company's financial ruin, about Mr. Vance's father selling his own car to pay the workers. There was no bond issue. There was no money. There was only the struggle to survive." She looked at Elias Vance, her eyes softening. "And there are also stories, Mr. Vance. Stories of your father's honor, of his refusal to sacrifice quality, even when it was bankrupting him." She turned back to Carter, her expression hardening again. "You tried to steal a company with a fraudulent document. That is securities fraud. You attempted to blackmail me with falsified evidence. That is extortion. You have built an empire on lies, Mr. Carter, and you made the mistake of trying to bully someone who values the truth more than money." She looked at the assembled lawyers. "The Ormont and Phil's board hereby retracts its acceptance of Carter Capital's offer. Furthermore, we will be submitting this evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the U.S. Attorney's Office this afternoon. I believe they will find it very compelling." Landon Carter sat frozen in his chair. The king was naked. The empire was a house of cards, and the whole thing had been brought crashing down by a quiet waitress who had learned from her grandfather that the smallest gear, the most overlooked detail, is often the one that makes the whole machine run. The fall of Landon Carter III was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, agonizing collapse, like a dying star shedding its layers. The SEC investigation, spurred by Clara's meticulously documented evidence, was swift and merciless. It unearthed a decade of corporate malfeasance, a labyrinth of shell companies, forged documents, and illegal market manipulation. Carter's empire, built on the illusion of invincibility, crumbled when exposed to the harsh light of scrutiny. His partners abandoned him, his investors sued him, and the financial press, which had once lionized him, now feasted on his carcass. He was a pariah. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. Carter, ever the fighter, spent the dregs of his fortune on a legal team that tried every trick to discredit Clara. They painted her as a vengeful hysteric, a corporate spy, a fantasist. But they could not argue with the watermark. They could not refute the historical ledgers. The truth, as Clara had predicted, was an immutable law. Landon Carter was eventually sentenced to 15 years in a federal minimum security prison. The man who had looked down on the world from his penthouse would now look at it through iron bars. For Clara, victory was not a celebration. It was a quiet exhalation, a release of tension she had been holding for years. Elias Vance, his spirit renewed, had been true to his word. Ormont and Phil's was saved. He had offered Clara a permanent, high-level position with the company, but she had politely declined. She had no desire for a corporate life. Instead, she had made a counter-proposal. With a portion of the settlement Ormont and Phil's won in their countersuit against Carter, they would establish a foundation in her grandfather's name. The Silas Thompson Horological Institute, dedicated to preserving and teaching the art of mechanical watchmaking to a new generation. Clara would be its director. On a crisp autumn afternoon, a year after the boardroom confrontation, a black car pulled up outside a modest, clean brick building in a quiet Chicago neighborhood. The bronze plaque by the door read simply, "The Thompson Institute." Inside, the air smelled of oil, brass and focused effort. Young men and women sat at watchmakers' benches, their heads bowed in concentration, loops fixed to their eyes, their hands moving with delicate precision. At the head of the room, moving from student to student, was Clara. She wore a simple white watchmaker's coat over a dress. There was a new confidence in her posture, a calm authority in her voice as she pointed out the subtle curve of a Breguet overcoil or the proper way to oil a jewel. Elias Vance, now in his 70s but looking a decade younger, stood by the door, watching her. He had flown in from Switzerland for the Institute's 1-year anniversary. "She has her grandfather's hands," he said to the man standing beside him, "but her grandmother's spirit, a will of iron." The man beside him nodded, a gentle smile on his face. It was Silas Thompson. The relief from financial worry, combined with the pride he felt for his granddaughter, had worked a miracle modern medicine couldn't. He was breathing easier, his strength slowly returning. He watched Clara guide a young student's hand, his eyes shining. Later that day, Clara was in the small office at the back of the Institute. An old newspaper was on her desk, folded to a small article in the business section. It was a final update on the Carter case. It mentioned that as part of his bankruptcy liquidation, the Pinnacle restaurant, his former haunt, had been sold. The new owner was an anonymous hospitality group. She felt a brief, distant pang of something that wasn't quite pity, and then let it go. There was a knock on the door. One of her students, a young woman named Maria, stood there nervously. "Director Thompson, there's a delivery for you." Clara followed her to the front workshop. Sitting on a reception desk was a large, flat box made of polished walnut. There was no card. Puzzled, Clara opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was the Aumont & Fils Grande Sonnerie. Landon Carter's watch. It had been fully restored, its platinum case gleaming, its complex face a marvel of order and beauty. Tucked beside it was a small, handwritten note on thick, cream-colored cardstock. "Miss Thompson, the U.S. Marshals Service is tasked with liquidating all seized assets of the Carter estate. This piece was scheduled for public auction. However, certain interested parties, myself included, felt its story was not finished. We pooled our resources and acquired it. We believe its rightful place is not on the wrist of a collector, but with the person who understands its heart. It is a gift, in recognition of a debt that can never truly be repaid. Sincerely, Elias Vance and the board of Aumont & Fils." Clara stared at the watch. The students gathered around, their eyes wide with awe at the masterpiece. She reached out, her fingers tracing the cool metal. Then she did what she had done in the restaurant a lifetime ago. She picked it up, closed her eyes, and lifted it to her ear. She listened, past the whispers of the students, past the distant traffic on the street. She listened to the tiny, perfect heartbeat of the mechanism, a steady, rhythmic, and flawless song. Tick, tock, tick, tock. A sound of order restored, a sound of truth, a sound of time, finally, on her side. She wasn't a waitress, she wasn't a victim, she was a watchmaker. And as she looked around at the legacy she was building, at the future she had secured, she realized Landon Carter had been right about one thing. Some people are meant to command, and others are meant to serve. He just never imagined that the highest calling of all was to serve a purpose greater than oneself.